Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to play Marvel Champions. Marvel Champions is a cooperative living card game by Fantasy Flight Games with a Marvel theme. I'm also going to simulate a few turns to give you guys an idea as to the rules and the structure of the game. So now we're going to go through our first round of play to show you how the game goes. Each round is divided into two phases. You have your player phase, where the different heroes or characters will take their actions in turn order. And then after all the players are done with their turn, we move on to the villain phase. So now I'll show you what the player phase looks like. So for starters, at the beginning of the game, you want to be well acquainted with what your character does when they are in alter ego form. In particular, Peter Parker here has this scientist ability. It's a resource ability. So that bold text is letting you already know where this will help you. He can generate a mental resource once per round. So basically, he can help you pay for cards without having to spend as many of your resources from your actual hand, because basically he will grant you a one card discount or a one resource discount thanks to the fact that he generates this mental resource. Also, for any particular cards, any particular events that are benefited from a particular mental resource, this would come in very handy. Quite often you have actions that are triggered and they have an additional cost, which is a specific type of resource. And sometimes you might not have the resource in your hand at the right moment, but this could be very, very helpful as long as it's an action that you can take in alter ego form. And that's something very important to keep in mind. Quite often your cards have words on them that say action. Action means that it's something you can do whether you are in alter ego or in hero form. However, quite often you will see actions that say hero action. In order to take these actions, you need to be in hero form. And the same goes with alter ego actions. In order to take those, you need to be in alter ego form. So now I know that the first card I buy, I could get a one resource discount. So now, I have this really cool attack action. It's not relevant because this here tells me that I could deal 5 damage to a minion. Well, there is no minion in play. And to activate an event or an action, there has to be an eligible target available. So that's something to keep in mind. You cannot just activate an event because you want to activate an event. There actually has to be a legitimate way to capitalize from it. And there is no minion in play, so I will not be able to do that. I might just set up Aunt May here for free. She only costs 1, so I could use that same science resource. I'll put her here beside me, and she's going to be useful. So whenever I take damage and I revert back to alter ego form, I can use Aunt May in order to heal up more quickly, because Spider-Man has a recover stat of only 3. That means each time I activate this ability, I'll only be able to recover 3 health. And sometimes that might not be enough. So that is really good. I did that already. Now let's see what else I want to do. At this point, I'm going to flip over from alter ego to hero form. And this is a very important part of the game. It's deciding when to flip into hero form and when to flip back into alter ego form. And here's the thing. You only get 1 free change of form per turn or per round. So you do not want to do that without thinking. You want to strategize and you want to map out what you're going to do for the rest of the turn, because once you flip over to the other side, you are done. Now, this is a cooperative solo game, so I'm pretty generous with myself as far as walking things back, as long as no new information has been revealed. But again, you do want to think through when you switch over from alter ego to hero form and vice versa. Now, there are some actions and hero-specific cards and abilities that allow you to break the rule of only switching form 1 time. But in general, players get 1 free change of form per round. Now that I'm in hero form, I can look at Spider-Man's stats here. And by the way, there's no specific order in which you have to do the actions that you take. Part of the game is figuring out which order is optimal for you, when to do what, when to switch over from hero form to alter ego and vice versa, when to attack or when to scheme, when to play an event, when to trigger the action of an upgrade or a support card. These are things that you can choose in whatever order makes most sense for you. But right now, I just want to look at the different basic stats. These here are referred to as basic actions. So whenever you read the phrase basic actions in a card, it's referring to your thwart, your attack, and your defense ability of your hero card. And basically, every time you want to activate one of these basic actions, you have to exhaust your hero card or your identity card, rotate them 90 degrees to indicate that this has already been used. Now, if your hero card has any additional abilities printed on their hero card or their identity card, you do not need to exhaust to activate those abilities unless the text specifically indicates that you do. In the case of Spider-Man, his ability is an interrupt. That means he would interrupt a particular action. In this case, it's the villain initiating an attack against you, and he would draw one card. So before the villain would be able to continue his attack action, Spider-Man here would be able to draw a card. Now, this is a defense stat. This is something that would happen during the villain phase, so it's irrelevant for the player phase. So Spider-Man has a thwart stat of 1. There is currently no threat on the main scheme, so I will not use his thwart action. Also, it doesn't really give me much bang for my buck because, as you can see, he has a better attack stat. So instead, I'm going to exhaust Spider-Man here to deal 2 damage to an enemy. There are no minions. However, if there were, I could choose to attack a minion, but I'm going to go for the main villain, Rhino, right here. And I'm going to take his health dial here and lower him by 14, from 14 down by 2 to 12. Now I'm going to see what else I can do. I do have this very useful power of aggression. I have this Spider Tracer and this Relentless Assault, which are both very useful cards if there were any minions in play. More often than not, there are no minions at the opening of the game. There are some villains that do, for their setup, include minions already engaged with the players, but this is not the case with Rhino. So I'm going to actually use one of these 2 cards. I think I'm going to use the Spider Tracer here, along with the power of aggression, to generate 3 resources. We have this 1 energy resource, and then we have the power of aggression, which will generate 2 resources as long as it's for another aggression card. And I will pay for this TAC team card. And this is a support card. So again, I mentioned earlier, support cards do not count as you. I'll just place these 2 spent resources in my discard pile. And it says here that we're going to use 3 attack counters. So I mentioned how quite often these cards have counters that you place on them, and this is exactly when you would take these green colored tokens and you would place them on top of that card, and these represent attack counters. And basically it tells us here that I could do an action, so it doesn't matter if I'm in hero or alter ego form. I can exhaust TAC team and remove 1 attack counter, and I could deal 2 damage to an enemy. And this is a really cool card because not only does it deal 2 damage, which is a solid amount of damage, but it says that it deals 2 damage, but it doesn't specify that it's an attack card. And we'll talk more about that later on. But sometimes there are cards that are played from the encounter deck or minions that are engaged with the players that will prevent the hero and all the cards that they control, their events, their upgrades, and their supports from attacking. And this is a way around it because whenever you have a card that does not say, it does not have the attack trait on it, or it does not say the words attack, instead it says deal damage, that is a way around, that's a loophole around these limitations of not being able to attack. So I have the TAC team, I'm going to exhaust them, and I'm going to remove one of these counters in order to deal an enemy 2 damage. And again, there are no minions engaged with me, so I don't really have a choice, but who better to attack than the main villain, since that is the goal of the game. So I will knock him down by 2, and he's now at 10 hit points. And he's only 10 away from defeating the first stage and moving on to the second stage. Now, I will say this video is just a tutorial as far as the rules, but little quick advice for strategy. Sometimes you do not want to beat the first stage of the villain too quickly because, again, they rev up in subsequent stages and they become very, very powerful. And early on, you might not have the necessary tools and the necessary engine to endure their stronger assaults. So that is pretty much it for my turn because I have these 2 cards and I cannot afford them. I have no other action that I can take based on my identity card or any of the other supports or upgrades in my player area. So I am done with my turn. And now, if we were playing a multiplayer game, the next player in clockwise order would take their turn. Now, after every player around the table has taken their turn and exhausted all possible actions, or at least the ones that they want to take, we then proceed to the end of player phase. And in this phase, in player order, each player may discard any number of cards in their hand. So again, if you want to speed up getting to some of the more specific cards that you're looking for as you build your deck and you get more familiar with the strategy, there may be cards that you're specifically looking for. If you want to go through these cards quicker in order to get to them, you do have the option of discarding as many cards from your remaining hand as you would like. Again, keep in mind that once you run through this deck, and every time you run through your hero deck, you will be dealt an additional encounter card, and we'll talk more about encounter cards shortly. The point is that there is a little bit of a consequence for speeding through your deck, but sometimes the cards you're looking for might be worth it. I will discard these 2 cards because, in particular, Relentless Assault, at the time being, I don't think it might have to be an issue, even though there are potential minions that might get engaged with me between now and the beginning of my next turn. So now I am done with that. Each player around the table would also have their opportunity to discard as many cards as they want from their hand. And then, after every player has made their decision as to how many or if they want to discard any cards at all, each player simultaneously will draw cards from their hero deck equal to their current hand size. And as I mentioned earlier, Spider-Man here, when he's in Spider-Man in hero form, his hand size is 5. So I will draw 5 cards. I have an ally, so that's another card type that I haven't talked about yet. These are probably the most valuable card types in the game because you can put them down and they can do so many things for you. Just like your hero, they can thwart for you, they can attack for you. Very often they have a special ability that triggers when they first enter into the game, and also they can defend against you against the attacks of minions and villains. So these are very valuable characters. They also have hit points just like your main character and the villain and the minions that are in the encounter deck. So this is how much damage they can sustain before they are discarded into your discard pile. So I have Tiger here. I have another Relentless Assault, so I really don't regret discarding the first one. I have another ally here, Mockingbird. And finally, I have Backflip. So all the players would draw back up to their hand size. And then again, simultaneously, each player would ready all their cards. So all those cards that you exhausted during your turn, after having taken their actions, you would ready them up. And now we are done with the player phase. Now we're going to move on to the villain phase. And the first thing that takes place in the villain phase is you place threat on the main scheme. And basically we have this stat here on the bottom. See this number here? It actually represents how much threat each scheme begins with. Most schemes, or many schemes at least, start the game with 0 threat, but there are schemes that from the very get-go already have some threat tokens placed on them. But here, this little number here in this triangular or house-shaped icon here, it says 1, and again it has the symbol for players, so 1 per player. So each round at the beginning of the villain phase, you're going to accelerate the scheme by 1 threat per player. In this case, there's only 1 player, and that's me. So we're going to add 1 token to the main scheme. After we have placed threat on the main scheme, the second part of the villain phase is their activation. So the villain will activate once per player. So if there are 3 players, there will be 3 activations. In this case, there's only 1 player, so there will only be 1 activation. And what the villain does with their activation depends on what side of the identity each player is on. So they're going to activate each of these activations separately. So the first thing in player order, right now, Spider-Man's the only player. If we were playing multiple people, whoever had the start player token, the villain would activate against them first. Now, if your character is in alter ego form, the villain is going to scheme. And each villain has a scheme stat represented here in this blue symbol here. And each villain also has an attack stat right here in the red. And as we can see, Rhino is much more effective at attacking than he is at scheming. So villains always have their strengths and their weaknesses. So if he was in alter ego form, he would be scheming. However, Peter Parker is not out and about taking photographs. Instead, Spider-Man is taking care of business. So if the character, the player, is in hero form, instead of scheming, the villain's activation will be an attack. Now, if you were playing a multiplayer game and some heroes were in alter ego form and other heroes were in hero form, again, Rhino or the villain would resolve each of those activations one at a time, depending on the form that your character is in. So with one character, he might be scheming, and with another character, he might be attacking. So he is going to attack Spider-Man. Now that I know that he's attacking Spider-Man, he is initiating the attack, and Spider-Man can trigger his spider sense ability, which actually interrupts this stage of Rhino's action. It doesn't mean that he's not going to carry through it, but before we continue, Spider-Man's going to interrupt it for a brief moment in order to activate this ability, which tells us that he can draw 1 card. So I will draw 1 card. It's a very useful ability that Spider-Man has. I drew this double resource. It's a double strength resource in particular. And now, usually when the villain attacks you, quite often, almost always, you will draw 1 or more boost cards. And the boost cards are basically just the cards from the top of the deck, from the encounter deck. Later on, when you play them, they represent an encounter card. Right now, they simply represent a boost to the character's main stats. So if the villain were doing a scheme activation, you would also draw a boost card. So unless the game text or the card text specifies otherwise, every time the villain takes an activation, whether it be scheming or attack, whenever you see those words, attack, scheming, or activates, you are always going to draw a boost card for the villain. So we have this card here, and before we reveal this boost card, the player has to make the decision as to what they're going to do with this attack. Now, the player could choose to just take the attack, and they will take the full brunt of the blow and have that damage taken or removed, that health removed from their health dial here. So the hero can choose to just take all of this damage, which we know will be at least 2, plus any boost icons here that will enhance the attack, and a card can have, typically speaking, from 0 to 4 boost icons. So the range, the potential range of his damage can be anywhere from 2 to 6. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in the base game, in the core set, more often than not, the different encounter cards don't have more than 2 or 3 boost icons. But that's something to keep in mind. You do not know the full range, the full extent of the damage until this card is revealed, but you have to make your decision first. Now, Spider-Man can also choose to defend, and each hero has a defense stat, and some characters have better defense stats than others. Spider-Man has a really good defense stat. He has a defense stat of 3. That means if I choose to defend, once I tally up all the potential damage that Rhino would have done, I would subtract that by 3, and that's how much actual damage Spider-Man would incur. So that's another option. Now, if I had allies, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most useful things that ally can do is they can defend an attack. Now, if an ally was in play already, I could choose to defend with the ally. Now, when an ally defends an attack against a villain, more often than not, that means the ally is going to be knocked out, because usually allies have a health of 2 or 3, occasionally 4 or 5, but the villains tend to hit harder than the minions and the other enemies in this game. So more often than not, these allies would go away, but at least they would protect your character, and also they would prevent you from having to exhaust your character, because in order to defend with Spider-Man, I would have to exhaust him. And if I exhaust him, that means unless I have an ability that allows me to ready sometime before or during my next turn, Spider-Man will not be able to take his basic actions, that is his thwart and his attack. As I mentioned, every time you take these basic actions, you have to exhaust your character, and you do not get a free ready of your character at the end of the villain phase. The only time that you're allowed to freely ready your character is at the end of the player phase. So do you want to defend, prevent that damage, but at the expense of not being able to take your basic actions? Now, again, you could still do any additional ability printed in the text box here. You would still be able to play cards and events and upgrades and supports to your heart's content, but you would not be able to take these basic actions if Spider-Man were exhausted. Now, I do not have an ally, and I do not want to defend because I have this backflip card. And sometimes you have these defense cards. Some heroes have them in their toolkit. One of the aspects, the protection aspect, has plenty of them. And sometimes you might want to play these defense cards in response to something that's happening. And I will. I will do this interrupt. First of all, I will reveal this boost card here, which we would look on the bottom right-hand corner here for these red arrow-shaped icons. And each of those arrow-shaped icons would have added an additional 1 damage to Rhino's attack. However, we were very lucky. This card here has no icons, no boost icons, so it's not going to add a single thing. So it's only going to be 2 damage. So now that I know that it's only going to be 2 damage, I might actually want to save my backflip, because this is a really good card for a more powerful attack. Let's say Rhino was dealing me 4 or 5 damage. I would have played this card without even flinching, without even thinking about it. But I'm actually going to decide to take that damage. I will decrease my health dial here by 2. Spider-Man now has 8 health. I'm not so concerned because Spider-Man has some pretty good defense cards already in hand. And again, as I mentioned early, he has an above average defense stat here of 3. So that's it. The villain has activated against me. So we already had the first part of the villain phase, which is the placement of the threat. We had the second part of the villain phase, which was the villain activating against me. If there were other players around the table, the villain would activate against them according to the side they are on currently on their identity card. Which form are they in? Are they in alter ego? Then the villain would scheme. Or are they in hero form? Then the villain would attack them. And they, if they are being attacked, would be confronted with the same decisions as I was. Do they defend with their character? Do they take the full brunt of the hit? Do they play a defense card? Or if they have an ally in their player area, do they choose to sacrifice that ally in order to protect their hero? Now, once the villain is done with the activation phase, the villain or the villain phase moves on to the encounter part of the phase, where basically each player is going to be dealt 1 face down encounter card. Now, after each player has been dealt their face down encounter card, in turn order, each player will reveal and resolve their encounters. And in this case, I've got this Sandman minion, and he's a pretty strong guy with some pretty good health here. And he has this toughness keyword. And in the core set, they do you the favor of, in parentheses, elaborating as to what these keywords mean. So this toughness one here means that this character enters play with a tough status card. So we will place him here near my player area. He is engaged with Spider-Man, always the player who was dealt the encounter card, if it's a minion, More often than not, that's the player who that minion will engage with. And we're going to give him this tough status card. The game does come with these status cards to represent some of the different statuses, like being stunned or being confused, which would prevent you from attacking and thwarting, or the villain from attacking and scheming, respectively. So Sandman here has this tough status card. Now, the tough status card tells us exactly what it does. It says here, the next time this character would take any amount of damage, discard this tough status card instead. So the next time I hit him damage, it's a waste of time other than getting rid of that tough status card. So I probably do not want to invest a really powerful attack in getting rid of that card. Now, there were other players playing. They too, in turn order, would reveal and resolve their encounter cards. And finally, after all players have resolved their encounter cards, again, if we were playing with more than one player, the current starting player would pass the starting player marker to the next player in clockwise order. And that would be the end of the villain phase. And then we would proceed to another hero phase with a new starting player. I am going to go through one more rapid fire hero phase or player phase and a rapid fire villain phase to give you guys a little bit more of an idea as to how the game is played. So I have these 6 cards now. Remember, Spider-Man has a hand size of 5, but because I triggered my spider sensibility and drew a card after having an attack initiated against me by Rhino, I do have these cards here. I have a lot of options here. I think I'm going to use this double strength resource along with this chase them down to play Mockingbird. And Mockingbird is a pretty useful ally. She's pretty weak with her stats. She only thwarts for 1 and attacks for 1, but she has this response that after she enters play, she can stun an enemy. So I'll put her here. She's basically gonna help me fend off the different bad guys. Quite often I'm kind of limited in space, but I usually have my allies somewhere in between my villain or the villains and myself. But in this case, I'm just going to place this card here. And as I mentioned, as soon as she enters play, she will stun a character, an enemy. So I will take the stun status, choose an enemy to place it on. I'm going to choose Rhino because even though Sandman has a stronger basic value of attack at 3, Rhino will always draw an encounter card or a boost card whenever he activates. So his potential for damage is greater than Sandman. So this is why Mockingbird is so useful, because you can use her immediately to stun an enemy. You can get a few weak activations from her, and eventually when you're ready to part ways with her, you can use her as a defender to protect your hero. Now, I do have these additional cards. I could choose to keep my backflip, and I was going to go that route, but now that I have Rhino stunned, I figured, you know what, instead, I gotta get rid of this tough status card. So I'm gonna use Spider-Man's basic activation. As I mentioned earlier, there's no particular order in which you have to carry out your actions. The only thing you really have to keep in mind is that you only get one opportunity to flip and change forms from hero to alter ego or vice versa. That's really it. Aside from that, you do not need to trigger your actions in any specific order. So I'm going to choose to do my basic attack first. I will exhaust Spider-Man, and this will get rid of this tough status card. So Sandman is no longer tough. Now I will choose to use this backflip and Tigra. I will use them as resources, play them here in my discard pile, in order to play this event, this Relentless Assault. And this tells me that I can deal 5 damage to a minion. And that is the card type for these enemies that are not the villains. They are the minions. And it tells us here that if I paid for this card using a fist resource, that means at least one of the resources I used was a fist resource. And this here, this backflip card, is a fist resource. Then I get to benefit from this bonus ability, and it tells me that this attack will gain overkill. And again, the base game is very user friendly, and it specifies what overkill means. It means that any excess damage from this attack is dealt to the villain, and 5 damage is more than enough for Sandman, who only has 4 HP. So 5 minus 4 equals 1, so there will be 1 excess damage. I will place Sandman here in the discard pile, and I will deal that 1 excess damage to Rhino over here, and now he is down to 9 health. Now I still have Mockingbird here, who I have not activated. Now you want to watch out for Rhino's main scheme, because it has a very low threshold, and believe it or not, it can sneak up on you. But you can also take advantage to some extent of the fact that Rhino has very low scheme stats. So I'm going to actually choose to exhaust Mockingbird here in order to deal 1 damage to Rhino. Whether I'm thwarting or attacking, all Mockingbird could do is just 1. So I will lower his health dial here from 9 down to 8. Now, it's very important to keep in mind with your allies that when you trigger these actions, more often than not, you're going to see these little star icons beneath their basic actions. And for each icon, at the end of the ally's activation, after everything has been resolved, any potential responses or retaliates, we'll talk more about retaliate perhaps some other time, but when any of these other triggers are resolved, the final thing that will happen during a ally's activation is they will take consequential damage for the actions that they took, and you will deal them 1 damage for each of these icons. Now, some allies actually have multiple of these icons on 1 or more of their basic actions. So that's something to keep in mind as you're making those decisions. Is it worth it? But for the most part, most allies only take 1 consequential damage for each basic activation. So Mockingbird here just finished attacking Rhino. There is 1 star here. She will take 1 consequential damage, which we will represent through the use of this damage token here. So Mockingbird has taken 1 damage out of her potential 3 hit points. So we have to watch out for her health. She won't be here for much longer. We might get 1 more basic activation from her, and then potentially I could use her to defend an attack against Rhino or maybe another enemy. So now I have no more cards in my hand. I have only 1 action I could activate. I actually have this Tack Team, which I mentioned earlier. If I exhaust them and discard 1 token, I will be able to do 2 damage to an enemy. And I will lower this from 8 to 6. Now, whenever these cards, these upgrades or supports that have particular tokens representing the fact that there's only a limited pool of actions you can take with this card, whenever the final token is removed, you will place these cards in your discard pile. They are done until you draw them again on a future turn. So now I have no possible actions, no cards to play from my hand. All my abilities are exhausted except for Aunt May, but she's an alter ego action and I'm in hero form. Now we are once again done with the player phase, or actually we're about to be done with the player phase. Next thing is all the players would choose whether or not they wanted to discard any cards. I have no cards, so that's not an option. And then simultaneously, all the players will draw back to their hand size. Again, Spider-Man has a hand size of 5 cards. And then players would simultaneously ready all the cards in their player area. Now we're going to go for 1 more go around with the villain phase before we wrap up this video. So again, the first thing that happens during the villain phase is you place threat according to their acceleration rate, which here is only 1 per player. So I will add 1 more threat token on this main scheme. Then the villains would activate once per each player. We're playing a solo game, and they would activate according to the form that their identity card is currently on. If I were an alter ego, the villain would scheme. However, I am in hero form, so the villain will attack. Now, it tells us here with this stunned status card that the next time this character would attack, instead, we discard this card. So the villain will not attack me this time because he was stunned. So stun is a very useful status that you can impose on your enemy. And quite often, the enemies can impose it on the heroes as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So now he is done with his activation phase. If there were other players, they would not benefit from that stun status. That stun status is a 1 and done. So the next player, if they were in hero form, they would be attacked. So keep that in mind. Stun has greater value in a solo game than it does in a multiplayer game, but it's always very useful. Now that we're done with the villains activation, we are going to move on to the dealing of encounter cards. And again, you deal one face down card per player. The only exception to this one face down card per player is, as I mentioned earlier, every time you run through your deck, you will immediately be dealt a face down encounter card. Now, you would not reveal and resolve that card then and there. That card would stay there waiting for you until the beginning of or until the end of the villain phase during the encounter section of that phase. So this would be the time, if you had additional encounter cards, to reveal them one at a time and resolve them. However, that has not happened yet, so I will only reveal one card. But there are some other side schemes and cards that have a encounter icon, which every time while they are in play, what that indicates is that during the encounter part of the villain phase, after each player has drawn one card or drawn one face down card per player, you would draw one additional card, not one additional card per player, just one additional card in total, and that would be dealt to the first player. Now, if there were multiple of these encounter icons in play, then you would draw one additional encounter card per encounter icon to the additional players starting from the first player. So if there was two, for example, then the starting player and whoever was the second player would be dealt an additional encounter card. Again, that's not necessary right now. We just have one encounter card. I will reveal and resolve, and it's Explosion. This is a treachery type of card for the villain encounters. This is the equivalent of an event. It's something that's resolved once and for all, and then you move on. It says when revealed, and when revealed is an important text here, because sometimes cards are discarded or sometimes they are they serve the purpose of being a boost card, but for them to be revealed, they need to come as an encounter card. And it says here that when this card is revealed, if a bomb scare is in play, if bomb scare is in play, and that is a scheme that's part of the bomb scare modular set, and it's not in play, if it were in play, we would assign X damage among heroes and allies, where X is the amount of threat on bomb scare. So you would count the amount of threat on the bomb scare side scheme if it were in play, and you would distribute that much damage among all the players and heroes according to how they decide. However, bomb scare is not in play, so instead this card gains surge, and surge is another keyword you need to look out for. Every time a card says this card gains surge, or it just says surge, it means you will deal the top card of the encounter deck to that player and they will reveal and resolve it. So basically, there's an additional card that I will draw. Sometimes cards that are like this, that are very situational, will have a surge condition if they're not able to resolve to their ultimate effect. And quite often, some really bad cards would still have an additional surge effect. And instead, I drew this Hydra Mercenary. He's a minion, pretty weak, but here's the thing, he's a guard. And this tells us right here what a guard is. It says that while this minion is engaged with you, you cannot attack the villain. So now I have this Hydra Mercenary engaged with me. And that's me, Spider-Man. If somebody else were playing with me, they are not engaged with the Hydra Mercenary, so they are not limited by him. But me, on the other hand, I cannot attack Rhino while I'm engaged with this player. So I have to eliminate this guy as quickly as I can in order to optimally be able to attack Rhino. Now, there are some loopholes around this. I mentioned earlier in the game that when the game refers to you, it refers to just your character and your hero. However, when it talks about this Hydra Mercenary, it has been clarified in future iterations of the rules that this applies to any card you control. So I wouldn't be able to use allies. I wouldn't be able to use anything or support cards in order to do that. Now, it does say specifically that I cannot attack Rhino. So other cards or other actions or other events that allow me to deal damage without the specific words attack are a loophole around the Hydra Mercenary, but you're not going to have as many of these actions as you would have attack actions. So again, you do want to get rid of him as quick as possible, but I would be able to use this tack team because again, the action here tells me I exhaust them, I remove one counter, and then I deal 2 damage without specifying that this is an attack. So this type of card would be a loophole around the guard cards for the time being. Now, there are some things that did not come up throughout the course of this playthrough video, and I would like to take a moment to briefly discuss these. So for starters, I mentioned earlier how we have boost cards that are revealed, and here on the bottom right hand corner of these boost cards, of these encounter cards, it's the very same encounter cards, we see these little arrow icons, and these arrow icons represent the boost icons. So whenever you're factoring a boost, you would modify the activation of the villain, whether it's their scheme stat or their attack stat, and you would add to their stat a number equal to the amount of these arrows that you reveal. And again, some cards have none, and you're very fortunate when you draw those. Quite often they have 1 or 2. Sometimes they even have 3 or as much as 4. You also have some special icons. They're like stars almost. None of the cards in this scenario have them, but they would be located somewhere next to these arrows, and they look basically like a star, and they're basically indicating that this card has a boost effect. That means other than just having a boost icon that will modify the particular activation of the villain, it also has an effect that will take place right then and there as the boost card is revealed. Before resolving that activation, you are going to take a brief moment to resolve whatever that boost effect might be. Now, another thing I want to discuss is these side schemes. So each villain has their main scheme, which consists of 1, 2, or even 3 stages. And that is basically the villain's end game or winning condition if they could advance their main scheme all the way through the final stage. However, within their encounter deck, you're going to find these different side schemes that are going to be shuffled in there, and you'll see this word here specifying that this is a side scheme. On the bottom here in this text box, you have this number 2, and that indicates that when this side scheme here, Bomb Scare, is put into play, it will be put into play somewhere in the villain area. You will place 2 threat tokens on this encounter immediately upon it entering play. Also, quite often, these encounters or these side schemes have a when revealed ability that gets resolved immediately. And more often than not, that when revealed ability involves placing additional threat here. So in the case of Bomb Scare, when this card is revealed, you place an additional 1 threat per player onto this card, and that's in addition to the 2 base value that this card will enter play with. So remember, I mentioned earlier, the when revealed is when this card is specifically being played from the encounter deck. Otherwise, it is not revealed. Quite often it's either discarded or it's a boost card, and then you do not resolve its when revealed effects. You would only resolve its boost icons and any other boost effect icons that might be printed on the card. So that's it as far as side schemes go. You also have attachment cards like this here. They usually are attached to the main villain or to a specific character, or sometimes just generically to a minion, and they'll usually have some type of temporary benefit or advantage for the villain as well. So these are the different card types that you will see. You have minions, which we already did come across those through the playthrough. So basically, you're going to keep on playing this game until the villain either goes through their main scheme and completes it to fruition, to its final stage, or till the villain knocks out all of the players by reducing them to 0 health. That's another way that the heroes can lose the game. But the heroes would win the game by first knocking out the villain, their first stage, or in the case of a expert game, their second stage. And after that, you would reveal their following stage. You would reset their hit dial according to their health, and usually the latter stages have a higher hit point value. And you would also resolve any when revealed effects when these latter stages of the villain cards are revealed. When you defeat the second stage of a villain, or in the case of an expert game, when you defeat their third stage, there's always going to be two stages. In the expert game, you're playing stages 2 and 3. In the standard game, you're playing stages 1 and 2. Once you've defeated the second of the two stages in the particular scenario, you have won the game. Now, another thing I wanted to mention are the special icons that sometimes occur on these side schemes. So for example, you have this here, which corresponds with the acceleration rate. And basically what this means is at the beginning of the villain phase, when you are adding threat to the scheme and you're factoring in the main scheme's acceleration rate, you're going to take this stat here on the main scheme and you're going to add or modify it +1 for each of these icons that might be in play. And in some occasions, you might have multiple side schemes that each have these icons, and you would add the total of each of these icons to this, and that would be the current acceleration rate. So in the case of, let's say, Bomb Scare being out as the only side scheme, it would add an additional 1 to the acceleration rate. So instead of adding just one threat to the main scheme at the beginning of the villain phase, now you are going to add 2. So when you see too many of these side schemes pop up, you are going to want to take care of them quickly. You also have different icons such as this. I did allude to this earlier. This is the additional encounter. This is referred to as the hazard icon. And for each of these icons that are in play, again, you can have multiple schemes having this icon. For each of these icons, you're going to draw an additional encounter. Keep in mind, it's not an additional encounter per player. It's just one additional encounter per icon. So if there are multiple players and there's only one icon, each player will get one encounter card, and the starting player will get one additional encounter card. And finally, the last icon that you need to keep in mind for the base game at least is this right here. This is the crisis icon. And basically this icon means that while this side scheme is in play, until you defeat this side scheme, you cannot thwart and remove scheme or remove threat from the main scheme. That's not something you're going to be able to do. So you could remove threat from a side scheme, from another side scheme while this is in play, but you cannot interact with the threat on the main scheme in any sense or any form. So when you see these crisis icons, you want to resolve them as quickly as possible so that eventually you get to the point where you can deal with the main scheme again. And that's it as far as those different icons and some of the things that I think are important for a new player to know, but that did not come up and throughout the course of this playthrough. And that's pretty much it as far as how you play this game. I know that I went on a little bit too long perhaps and only covered 2 rounds and the setup, but I hope that it was useful. Please comment down below in the comment section if you have any additional questions as to how the game plays, if you have any confusion or misunderstandings about some of the rules that I discussed, or maybe some of the rules that I overlooked. I will be reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.